Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second seminar with Io Magwood for Uprooting Inequity. My name is Onar Primitivo. I serve as the Executive Director of Equity and Justice in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and we're excited to have you here. We have a couple of our staff members are serving key roles. Cynthia and Hala will be monitoring the chat and also the attendance. Because part of it also what we're excited about is we have partnered with our HR to make this into a certification program, right? So if you have had a chance to look at what the on our website is, you need to attend the 3 mandatory that IO has suggested for us, and also additional 3. But we are very much excited in terms of your presence because we know this is critical for us as we move the needle around equity and justice. So that's the certification component. And also I want to share with you, let's see here. Share that piece. Okay. So we are. So today's seminar session is the historical reproduction of anti-Black racism. And as typical, we always begin with our land acknowledgement, and it states, local indigenous people, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who understand the earth as a place for everyone, first inhabited the land where UC Merced is located. When we address diversity on this campus, we do so boldly, daring to look forward and backwards, imagining diversity's demand for the 21st century, and the importance of diversity in addressing past wrongs, reaffirming humanity, and ensuring a reconciliatory path of redress for the future. The most prominent path on our campus is called Scholars Lane, and by day you can see, hear, and witness the embodiment of our diversity through campus. Community members making their way across campus, framed by the slopes and peaks of the Sierra Nevada. So that is our land acknowledgement. And again, part of it is for us to also reflect, right? We have 5 more exciting times with IO. And again, part of this engagement is really around reflection, sharing our time together. And with that, we have a couple more things around community agreements and guidelines for engagement, right? That we are sharing airspace, 1 DVEX, 1 mic, right? Meaning that we are practicing that active listening. That again, that reflection and participation piece in the chat is critical, right? Yes, I myself is a very reflective person, right? And I can always share later, meaning that I'm always processing this good information, new information, and that I have not been purview to. So process, whether at home, in chat, in discussion with OEDI staff. We love to chat with you all, especially around this topic. And again, part of it, what I was excited about when I was like, everything comes together on seminar 7, the goal to bring us, to bring this reflection back to our daily practice and how we can do that active participation and how we can commit to action in making a better Bobcat community. And so I will introduce our speaker. Let me stop share and get to the chat or to the Zoom. So Io Magwood, who is the founder of Uprooting Inequity, is an educational consultant specializing in in-depth evidence-based education on the history, economics, and sociology and cognitive psychology of structural racism. She also equips institutions with tools and strategies to foster a more productive conversation about racism using her perspective consciousness approach. Her pro-equity model is a K-12 instructional approach for teaching an inclusive and critical honest curriculum that also fosters perspective consciousness, civic skills and dispositions, and shared we identity. right? So critical for us, for UC Merced. Again, IO has over 10 years of classroom experience in both majority low-income Black Latino charter schools and majority high-income white private schools. IO has a BA in Economics and International Relations from Brown University and a Master's of Science in Applied Economics from Cornell University. So IO, I will hand it off to you, and again, welcome you with some great staff from UC Merced.
Okay, I can go ahead and share. Okay, great. Hopefully this works this time. Can everybody see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. So thank you, everybody, and I appreciate you having me here. I'm very excited about everything I've learned about University of California, Merced, and I'm out of all my seminars, this is, I think, one of the ones I'm most excited about. So thank you for having me here. So this is seminar 2 in your series. It's called The Reproduction of Racism. It's going to be a really quick overview from 1865 to 2000. I'm covering a lot of ground. I'm trying to trace the patterns. So I obviously can't cover all of the history of anti-Black racism throughout that period, but I'm trying to trace the conceptual framework, the patterns that are running through it. Okay, so a few logistics here. Go ahead, if you have any clarifying questions, put them in the chat and someone, I believe Onar, will communicate them to me. I can't check the chat myself until the breaks, but feel free to use it to communicate with other participants. This is, like I said, this is a lot of material and it's a lot of patterns and concepts. So it's dense and complex. So I strongly encourage you to use active learning strategies like you would use in the classroom, such as note-taking, asking questions, and discussing, rather than just listening, which is passive learning. And so, for example, you may choose to take notes in the outline provided in the Word doc. I believe Cynthia just provided a link to it. Or you can share your thoughts in the chat when I request. So I'm going to stop halfway through and request that you share in the chat and at the end. So if you really don't want to share in the chat, then you can go ahead and use the outline instead. You definitely need to do one or both. You need to do one or the other. I would prefer the chat because that allows us to hear all the voices in the room, even if you don't choose to participate verbally in the discussion. Before we open up the discussion, I'm going to take a few minutes, and all we're going to do is write and read. We're just going to take a few minutes for everybody to share their thoughts and for us to read them so we can hear everybody in the room. It's a great way of sharing the space. So I very much encourage you to participate in the chat in those 2 periods, okay? But if you really don't want to, you can instead use your outline at home. And then, so we're gonna have one, like I said, one mid-presentation processing break and one end of the presentation processing break, followed by the discussion. And please share the airspace during that discussion. Okay, so what I mean by active learning versus passive learning, and this is useful in your college classrooms as well, or anywhere you go, just remember that you only remember 10% what you read, 20% of what you hear, 30% of what you see, 50% of what you see and hear, for example, this workshop, but 70% of what you say and write, ooh, that's why we practice note-taking skills and discussion, and 90% of what you do. Unfortunately, we can't do that here, but hopefully after we finish the presentation, then you'll be able to go out in the world and actually do something about this. So some examples of what you should be doing in your notes or when you're speaking or discussing this, or when you are taking notes, is distinguishing the main idea from supporting evidence, summarizing the main ideas in your own words, making connections to prior knowledge or to your personal life, identifying cause and effect, identifying patterns, asking questions, discussing. All of that are examples of active learning, which will help you understand and retain the information and ideas better. Okay, so this is, again, the second seminar in this series. And And this is my agenda for today. I'm not going to bother reading it. I'll read it as we go along. Right now, we're going to do the introduction, but it's the exact same outline that's in that Word doc if you're following along at home. Okay. So, but first, we're going to do a quick 2-question poll on Mentimeter. So I want you to take out your phone and you can scan this QR code with the camera, and it's 2 questions. So I'm going to keep quiet for a minute while you do that.
Yes.
Cynthia, do you think that was enough time?
Let's see. Are you able to view the poll?
Yes, but I don't want to see it before, you know, when you give it. Yeah.
Let's do 20 more seconds, y'all. So if you can respond to the poll to open up today's session, that'd be great. So let's say 15 more seconds before IO checks the results.
Okay.
Quick question on the poll. You can't change your answer, can you? Once you submit it, you can't change it, can you?
I don't, that's a good question. I haven't,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter though. It's not a big deal.
I tried to change it and I couldn't.
Okay. I'll change the setting for next time. It never occurred to me that somebody would want to change it, but
Gotcha.
okay. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and oops. Okay, so here we are. Ooh, you guys are this is the most accurate results I have ever seen, and I have done this poll countless times. And this is the most accurate I have ever seen it. This is incredible. We're going to see the answer in a minute, but I'll go ahead and give it away. It's 10. And then, that's interesting. It's okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll see the national results and the regular results too, but it's very interesting. Okay. So this is that poll that was researchers did it on a national level, and the perception was 90%. Completely off. So granted, they did this in 2016 before the George Floyd protests brought more attention and a slightly more information out, but they were completely off. So perception was, the survey said 90% and the reality is 10. And notice that they also asked them to guess for every 10 years going back to 1963, which is of course 1 year before the Civil Rights Act. And they, the surveyed Americans greatly overestimated the amount of progress there has been since the Civil Rights Acts, and they greatly underestimated the racial wealth gap. And interesting thing is all those dots are guesses. So that means, you notice the guesses go all the way up to 200. So there's people up who thought that Blacks made twice as much as whites. I mean, had twice as much wealth as white, which is astounding. And if you wanted to know what it was for the same for other groups, for Asians, there's perception, there's reality. That red bar across is 100%. So 100%, which would be that they have the exact same wealth as whites. For Latinx, there's perception versus reality, and for Blacks, there's perception versus reality. So it's interesting, the Latinx wealth is slightly higher than Black, but yet people perceive Blacks as being wealthier than Latinx. So that was sort of my hook into the workshop. There's this huge myth about the Civil Rights Acts ending racism. Obviously, you guys aren't falling for that, but so when I refer to the Civil Rights Acts in this seminar, I'm going to be referring to all four of them: Brown versus Board of Education, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 65, and Fair Housing Act of 1968. So let's look at the data. So we already saw that wealth is not, the racial wealth gap is not decreasing. In fact, it's increasing. So this is median household wealth adjusted for inflation from 1960 to 2016. Now, wealth is not the same as income. So wealth means not just income, not just what you earn from your job, but also your assets, such as stocks and bonds, the value of your house, home equity, et cetera. That's what wealth is. And you can see, and there's the white median household wealth, and there's Black median household wealth. And you can also see that it's Black median household wealth has been decreasing since the Great Recession because Blacks never, and Latinos, well, Latinos recovered a little bit, but Blacks haven't recovered yet from the Great Recession. What about, and also, by the way, that racial wealth gap does not go away based on educational level. So here it is, the wealth gap broken down by educational level. And you see that median household net worth for families, that net worth is the same thing as wealth. For families led by whites with a high school diploma is higher than of Blacks with a bachelor's degree. Pretty sad. And poverty hasn't improved either since the 1960s. So this is kids born between 1955 and 1970. So roughly around the time the civil rights movement. So 33% grew up, Blacks grew up in that generation, grew up in medium poverty, 29% in high poverty, compared to the kids born in 1985, 2000, so more recently. These people are 21 to 36-year-olds. Again, they're pretty much the same thing. 35% grew up in medium poverty, 31% grew up in high poverty. So not much change. What about home ownership? Has that changed? Not really. In fact, it's gotten worse, in fact. So there's the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and yet the gap is increasing. Only 44% of Black households own their homes, compared with nearly 74% of whites. What about college attainment? That's not getting better either. Also going in the wrong direction. It's actually, the gap is actually increasing. What about racial segregation? Weren't the Civil Rights Act supposed to get rid of racial segregation? This is 2016 data. We're not looking very integrated to me. And there's Fresno, California. I believe that's close to you, right? Stark segregation between Latinos and whites. And the red is Blacks. And these aren't cherry picked. Pretty much every city in the country looks like this. Vast segregation. And same thing with schools. This is public school segregation. Wasn't Brown versus Board of Education supposed to do something about segregated schools? This doesn't look very integrated to me. I'm not seeing too much change. So yes, the Civil Rights Acts were very, very successful in dismantling Jim Crow in the South. And we can't underestimate that. And that is great. However, in other areas, civil rights laws weren't very effective. For example, in expanding, and they also helped in expanding the Black middle and upper class, but particularly through affirmative action, which is now illegal. So we'll see how that goes in going forward. But with respect to dismantling residential and school segregation, well, we saw those maps, right? And with respect to narrowing the Black-white wealth gap, that's a big no, right? And in improving working and Black working lower class access to employment, housing, and education, and alleviating concentrated Black poverty, I think we know the answer to that. And we don't even mention reduced police harassment of Blacks. I apologize, there's something wrong with my keyboard. It's sticky. I'm having trouble with the animation for some reason. So as the cognitive psychologist Jennifer Richardson, she was one of the authors of that study, about the comparative wealth to racial, the different races. So she wrote sort of like a layman's summary, non-scientific summary in The Atlantic called "Americans Are Determined to Believe in Black Progress, Whether It's Happening or Not." Love that title. She wrote, "It is obviously true that many of the conditions of life for Black Americans have gotten better over time, but many areas never saw much progress, or what progress was made has been halted or even reversed. The mythology of racial progress often rings hollow when it comes to, for instance, racial gaps in education, or health outcomes, or voting rights, or criminal justice, or personal wealth. And we saw some of this data, right? So the reality is very different from the myths. So this raises two interrelated questions. Why has there been so little progress in racial economic equity in the 57 years since the Civil Rights Act? And the second question is, why do most Americans so vastly overestimate racial economic progress? And those, you may recognize these because these are the two questions that my seminar answers. And if you're following along at home with the outline, you'll notice that these are the two questions listed in the introduction section. Okay, so this is that was the agenda. So next is in answering those two questions, we're going to look at how the accumulated gains of past discrimination were never repaired. So again, this is written down in the outline, but section 2, the summary of it. So with each section, I'm going to summarize it before I explain that section, and then I'll show you this exact same summary as we finish the section. So that way I tell you what I'm going to teach you, and then I teach you, and then I tell you what I taught you, okay? So in this section, we're going to learn that Civil Rights Acts only outlawed future discrimination. They prohibited people from discriminating in the future, but they did nothing about the accumulated gains of past discrimination, centuries of past discrimination. And those, we're going to learn, continue to impact the present, primarily through the racial wealth gap and segregation, or the geography of opportunity. Okay, so let's go for it. So wealth accumulates, and wealth and segregation affect the races through, you can think of it as like a monopoly game, right? So imagine if whites, blacks, and Latinos have been playing Monopoly, and then after centuries of whites only being able to play it, and they have what do you call it, money, and they have houses, real estate, and then after, but blacks and Latinos aren't allowed to play. And then suddenly they say, okay, blacks and Latinos are allowed to play, but whites get to keep all of their houses and their money. And of course, it's very difficult to catch up. So that you can think of the effects of historical discrimination like that. So the legacies of historical racial discrimination continue to impact racial disparities today. You can think of it as an iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg, that what shows is the present day racial disparities. You can see the differences in college attainment rates, in differences in wealth, differences in home ownership, right? That's the only thing we see, but those are rooted in, remember my name of my organization, my consultancy is called Uprooting Inequity, because I'm very focused on these root causes, like these historical causes. These things didn't just, this historical discrimination didn't just disappear in the past. It didn't just stop to exist. It continues to have impacts on the racial disparities today, even though we can't see them. That's what today's session is about, how they continue to impact. So again, the legacies of historical racial discrimination continue to impact racial disparities today. There we have our historical discrimination, and they have three major impacts. Obviously, anti-Black bias and stereotypes. That's obvious, right? But the two less obvious ones are the racial wealth gap and residential and school segregation. Those are the main two ways that our history of racial discrimination continues to affect racial disparities today. Okay, so let's look at the racial wealth gap first. So as we saw, the racial wealth gap has been increasing rather than decreasing since the 1960 Civil Rights Act. So why is this happening? Well, first of all, we started with that gap. You see that gap in 1960? Nothing was done about that. We just went on. And of course, you know, it takes wealth to make wealth. And where does that wealth gap in 1960 comes from? Well, it comes from an entire long history of racial discrimination. Blacks and often Latinos were excluded from centuries of government subsidies that were only available to whites. Some historians refer to it as white affirmative action. Let's go through some of the highlights. So the monetary value of slavery is estimated, depending on the study, in today's money would be between 14 billion to 10.7 trillion. Obviously, formerly enslaved persons never received any compensation or reparations. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of quote unquote free land that they stole from indigenous people to 1.6 million white citizens. Less than 6,000 Black families benefited, and also non-white immigrants were excluded. The New Deal minimum wage and overtime laws and Social Security program transformed the lives of white workers and the elderly. But they intentionally excluded the job categories that most Blacks and Latinos had at that time, which were domestic labor and agricultural labor. And you notice even still today, they don't have a minimum wage, right? The Wagner Act protected union collective bargaining, greatly increasing security and wages of blue collar workers. Blacks and Latinos were excluded illegally from unions until the 1960s. It depends on the city and the state, of course. But in practice, through the 1970s and even in 1980s, for example, in New York City, the GI Bill spent the equivalent of what today would be $119 billion. It gave free college tuition to 2.2 million veterans, training to 5.6 million veterans, and unemployment benefits to nearly 9 million veterans. Very, very few Black and Latino veterans benefited. Unlike the others, they were officially, formally eligible, but in the South, the Southern congressmen refused to pass the GI Bill until they were able to write in that they could administer it the way they wanted to in the South, which meant, of course, without giving it to Blacks and Latinos. And plus the schools were segregated, so it was very difficult to, even if you managed to get a GI Bill money, you had nowhere to spend it since schools were segregated. And then we're going to learn about more today is the FHA and the VA spent the equivalent of what would today be $1 trillion on highly subsidized mortgage loans. Like when we're talking about highly subsidized, it was cheaper to purchase a brand new, what do you call it? A set of, I can't think of the word, separated, not a row house. What's it called? Somebody help me out. You know what I'm talking about. I can't think of the word. But a
single family.
Yes, a brand new single family home with all the latest modern amenities. You could purchase that cheaper than you could rent a tiny little, very old, decrepit apartment. So that's what we're talking about, highly subsidized, creating a complete new middle class we're going to see. And in addition to that, Polk spent the equivalent of what would be today $2 billion on refinancing. But less than 2% of all of the subsidized mortgages went to all non-whites. And at the same time, the federal government imposed racial segregation and redlining on Black neighborhoods. The GI Bill benefits helped millions of white families move into the middle class. By 1955, about 2.2 million veterans have participated in higher education. The country gained more than 400,000 engineers, 200,000 teachers, 90,000 scientists, 60,000 doctors, and 22,000 dentists. Another 5.6 million veterans enrolled in some 10,000 vocational institutions. 4 out of 5 men born in the United States during the 1920s served in the military, and about half of them used the GI Bill for education and training. Oh, and by the way, not only did they pay for your tuition and costs, but they also paid for a stipend, a living, paid for your entire family to live while you were getting this education. It was sweet, let me tell you. Also, very important to note is that this was open to not just rural people, first-generation immigrant offspring and veterans from working middle-class backgrounds, but also to Catholics and Jews who up until this time, you might remember my first workshop, weren't considered quite white. But the 1-2 of World War II, where all the soldiers were mixed in together, plus that they gave the federal government giving these benefits to Catholics and Jews, allowed the Catholics and Jews to become white. And so a lot of times people will say, well, my grandparents, my great grandparents were immigrants, and they came here and they came up from nothing. And so why can't Blacks and Latinos do it? But they sort of leave out that the so-called ethnic European immigrants had access to these huge subsidies while Blacks did not. And this is from Charles Bolt. He wrote he is the chairman of the American Veterans Committee. And he is in this pamphlet, he writes, over 1 million dark-skinned ex-servicemen are, by training, discipline, sacrifice, and determination, prepared for integration into the nation's life as first-class citizens. The nation has almost universally failed to grasp the enormous opportunity which is presented through veterans' benefits for this minority group. It is as though the GI Bill had been earmarked for white veterans only. So he wrote this in 1947. So he was very angry that the Southern congressmen had insisted on implementing it in a segregated racist way in the South, which is where the vast majority of Blacks were. So I should note that Blacks who were in the North did benefit from the GI Bill, but there were very few Black veterans in the North. Most of them were in the South. So that's the GI Bill, and now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this FHA and VA mortgage loans, okay, and the redlining, because that's important. So during the 1930s, partly in order to help the country recover from the Great Depression, and partly to support the veterans, the federal government set up two federal mortgage insurance programs. One was for first-time homeowners. And this was administered through the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and the Veterans Administration for the vets. And this was where most of the money went, because in the 1930s, only rich people owned houses. So most people were first-time homeowners. The government decided that this was the best way to recover from the Great Depression, was to increase home ownership. Again, only wealthy people at this time owned houses. So they put a lot of money into this program. So it created the backbone of today's mortgage and home building industries. Home ownership became affordable for the first time to working and middle classes. It basically created the suburbs. The suburbs did not exist before this time. And it created the white middle class. The middle class didn't quite exist at this time. So through this program, down payments were 0 to 10%. Before this program, or outside of this program, down payments were 50%. Now you see why only wealthy people owned houses. And the terms under this program were 25 to 30 years to pay back the loan. Previously, and outside of this program, you only had 3 to 10 years to pay back the program. And again, now you see why only wealthy people owned homes. And if these terms look familiar to you, of the program, 0 to 10% and 25 to 30 years, that's because this is the industry now. The entire private industry uses the terms that were created through this program. It was also fully amortized and low interest rates. And it was huge. This program was huge. By 1950, the FHA and the VA were insuring 50% of mortgages. Okay. So, but it sounds nice, right? But the FHA restricted these mortgages to whites only. This is the federal government. Okay, so they in the textbooks they like to say, well, you know, it's just some racist whites who were. No, it was the federal government that was segregating, okay, and discriminating. They imposed racial discrimination and segregation on both private builders and homeowners. So the appraisal standards stipulated in their underwriting manual included a whites-only requirement, because supposedly the infiltration of inharmonious racial groups would undermine property values and increase risk of default. They never provided any evidence for this. And they recommended racially restrictive covenants, which means it means that it's a clause in the deed of the house or in the deed of the housing development that says white only or no Blacks and Jews, for example. And they favored areas with natural or artificial barriers from Blacks and also with segregated schools. And they financed entire white-only subdivisions and suburbs such as Levittstown. And they discouraged loans in urban neighborhoods. And again, less than 2% of this 120 billion back then would be the equivalent of over $1 trillion today that the federal government underwrote in new housing between 1934 and 1962 went to all non-whites combined. So let me show you what a huge impact this program had. So in the 1940, the middle class was only 10%, only 10% of Americans were in the middle class. Okay, granted, this was after the Great Depression, but still, but basically this middle class is a modern phenomenon. It is a post-1950 phenomenon. For centuries, there was no such thing as a middle class. But the middle class jumped from 10% of Americans in 1940 to 50% of the country in 1970. And this program, economists believe that this program was a huge part of it. And what about home ownership? So in 1940, only 43% of Americans were homeowners. Again, you can see it dropped slightly from 1930 because of the Great Depression, but you can see it wasn't very high to begin with. Again, home ownership is a modern phenomenon. By 1970, home ownership jumped from to 63% of the country. And again, it was through this program, but again, the program was only available to whites. And by the way, this is what those new suburban developments look like. This example is Levittown. All the pictures are from Levittown, which was the most affordable. Most of the people were from low-income families. And this is shot them from the low-income families into the middle class. This is how the middle class grew so high. But remember, I told you there were two programs, right? There was two federal mortgage and insurance programs. Remember, that other one was for first-time owners, which was most people, right? But they also had another one for existing homeowners. This one was through a different federal agency. It was administered through the Homeowners Loan Corporation called HOLC. And this is the agency that redlined Black neighborhoods that we're going to learn about. So from June 1933 to June 1935, HOLC provided more than $3 billion in refinancing. They created these quote unquote residential security maps to evaluate lending risks in 239 cities. So basically the whole country. These maps are what we informally call today redlining maps. So on these maps, neighborhoods graded D and colored red on the map were considered high risk or hazardous. An important factor in the grade was the presence of Blacks and certain immigrants like Mexicans. These areas were quote unquote redlined by lending institutions, which means that they were denied access to capital and investment regardless of the creditworthiness of the individual. So it's as if you're applying for a loan and the bank only goes as far as your address. And that's all they need to know. So it doesn't, you are in this neighborhood, you're denied the loan. So the term redlining comes from these maps. It comes from that area. We still use that term to mean the same thing, where the entire neighborhood is considered a bad risk. And scholars believe these redlining maps were used by private and public entities for years. And by the way, most gentrification and the subprime mortgages, some people call it reverse redlining, happened in the same areas where redlining had depressed housing values long ago. So because these areas often have absolutely fantastic architecture, fantastic houses, but the values have been have crashed from decades of being denied any loan, any finance, any capital. Can you imagine? These neighborhoods are completely destroyed. So wealthy people come in and swoop up the areas and fix up the houses. So most places where gentrification have occurred were areas that used to be redlined. And also during the banks, right before the Great Depression, banks often targeted those areas for subprime mortgages. Like even when people in the neighborhood were qualified for conventional mortgages, they would sell them subprime mortgages because that was more profitable to the bank, and they would target that entire area. So people called it reverse redlining because it's the same thing, has nothing to do with the individual, but the whole neighborhood. So here is a residential security map, which we call it a redlining map, for Fresno, California, 1936, okay? So the green areas are best. The blue areas are still desirable. Yellow is definitely declining, and red is hazardous. Don't lend it to that area. So that, and they give explanations. So the areas to the right, northwest, those were all poor whites or low income or white laborers. The areas over here, the larger areas on the left were that area was Japanese, Chinese, Negroes, and uneducated Italians. That area was uneducated Armenians, and this area was Mexicans, uneducated Germans, Russians, and Italians. So because of the presence of those populations, no credit for you, for anyone. And in fact, that also led to white flight because the entire area was redlined. That meant that whites in that area also couldn't get loans. So that led to a massive white flight, because imagine your typical white person. If I stay here, I get redlined. If I move out to the suburbs, I get a fancy new house that's practically given away, that's actually cheaper than I can rent. You see, it's a no-brainer. So you have both pull and push factors leading to massive white flight out into the suburbs, because there's both push factors, try to get away from redlining, and there's pull factors with these loans and these beautiful houses in the suburbs, with also subsidized schools and subsidized highways and subsidized parks. Of course, Blacks didn't have that option because the suburbs were white only. So Blacks and Latinos were stuck in the cities. And that's how the quote unquote ghettos were born. The government, just to help things along, also built the highways, because of course the white people in the suburbs needed to get to their jobs in downtown. So the government built subsidized highways through the Black and Latino neighborhoods, which of course further deteriorated the values of the housing in the inner city. They also dumped the factories there, the jails, pollution, et cetera, was all dumped into Black and Latino neighborhoods. So, surprise, surprise, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They said their justification for denying loans to these areas was that they were a bad risk, but then they immediately made tons and tons of decisions and disinvestment, which led to those areas deteriorating. This is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. It means when you say something is going to happen, but then you make it happen. It's not just a coincidence that it happened. So that is how, that gives you an idea of this. And these were just the last two, the more recent of that whole history of white affirmative action. And it has consequences, it affects today. So remember, through the racial wealth gap, because remember the two ways is that the historical racial discrimination affects today is through the racial wealth gap and through geography, right? Okay, so first we're going to look at how the racial wealth gap affects people today. So on one hand, whether your family has wealth or not is going to affect whether you have a safety net to take professional risks, whether you have help to pay for a down payment on your home, whether you have help to start a business, whether you have wealthier, more educated parents. It's not just the actual money, but also, the more educated parents and the contacts, the personal contacts help you get a job. And also that not only is it the wealth that you receive, but it's also the income that you don't have to pay. So for many Blacks and Latinos, and some Asians, because they're first generation, not only are they to go to college, not only are they not receiving financial help from their parents, but they often have to help support parents and relatives. Their parents or their grandparents or their aunties or their cousins or their siblings may not have health insurance or may be unemployed. And so they're paying out a lot of money. And also it's going to, the amount of wealth you have in the family is going to affect where you live, geography. And that is in a different color because that leads us to our next point, okay? So blue We looked at the racial wealth gap. Now let's look at segregation and how that affects us today. So we saw this, right? So how does this happen? Did this happen? Is this just a coincidence? Is this because people just want to live with their own? Not quite. This is partly, it's a legacy of historical redlining, and housing discrimination. So you remember that map of Fresno, this is that redlining map that we saw on the left, right? So here on the right is a map of poverty in Fresno in 2017. Okay. It's not perfect, but you can see there is a correlation. Remember, the Southeast was where Blacks and Latinos were, and poor people, and that has the greatest amount of redlining. And you can see that there's a correlation with poverty today. In other areas, the correlation is stronger, but I wanted to show you the Fresno map since you're more likely to be familiar with it. And let's look at how this racial segregation, the segregation patterns, these residential patterns affect people. Sociologists refer to this as the geography of opportunity. You see, because where you live affects your access to opportunity. Where you live affects whether you live in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty or a neighborhood of concentrated wealth. And that's separate from your own level of income or wealth, because again, an area of concentrated poverty is going to have less access to resources, and a neighborhood of concentrated wealth is going to have much greater access to resources. Where you live is going to influence how much exposure you have to environmental pollution, whether your access to public safety, your exposure to aggressive policing, your access to healthcare, your access to adequate transportation and employment opportunities, your access to good quality schools, definitely that one, right? Because we have neighborhood schools. Your access to mainstream credit, your access to groceries, retail, and services. It matters, right? So, and of course, one of the biggest things, like I mentioned, is the access to schools. So segregated neighborhoods lead to segregated public schools. That's another way that historical redlining affects schools and wealth today. So because of that, look at the differences in school funding, right? Because school funding, as you might know, 45% of the school's budget comes from local property taxes, okay? Unlike in Europe or Australia or New Zealand, where the federal government pays each school the same amount per student, of course, and adjusted by cost of living. But all schools get the same amount. But in the United States, because of federalism, 45% of school budgets comes from local property taxes. So the wealth of the area affects the quality of education that students are getting. And again, the wealth of the area and the wealth of the houses is impacted by this historical redlining, this historical segregation. But look at the huge differences between, and it's not just by poverty level. You notice that non-white, low poverty, non-white districts have less funding per student than low poverty white districts. Black children are more than twice as likely as white students to attend high poverty schools. So basically, we do not have a public school system. We have a quasi-private school system that we call public. Okay, so that was one of the longer sections, but this is what we learned. We learned that the Civil Rights Act only outlawed future discrimination. They did not repair the accumulated gains of past discrimination, which continue to impact the present through the racial wealth gap and racial segregation. Okay, we're gonna do one more section before we have the break. Okay, and this is another of the long sections. And now that I think about it, I should have had the break before this. In fact, I wonder, maybe we can switch up. Okay, I'm gonna switch up because this was long. So I apologize for this, but I'm going to see. Okay, here we go. So we're going to have a 5-minute processing break. I'm encouraging you to connect, extend, and challenge. And you have a choice. You can do this in the chat. And I would strongly encourage you to do this in the chat, because that way we can see what everyone is thinking. We can get a broad view of the world, of the room, as we say. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, then you can do it in your notes at home. But I strongly encourage you not to just sit there. Okay. So here are some of the things you can think of. You don't have to answer all of these, but there must be something in here that you can respond to. How are the ideas and information in this seminar connected to what you already know? What new ideas did you learn that extended or broadened your thinking in new directions? Or what challenges, puzzles, or questions have come up in your mind from the ideas and information presented? Also, if you prefer, you can just summarize the main ideas that you've learned so far, especially if you're working with your outline. Okay, so we're gonna be silent for about 3-4 minutes while you think and write, and while we read what other people are writing in the chat.
Thanks, Ayo, and I'll start the 4-minute timer.
Thank you. Oh, sorry about that. Oh my goodness.
Okay, one more minute. Thanks, group. Great. A couple more seconds and we can restart IO.
Okay.
And we're good.
Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next big section, and then after that, the rest of the sections are shorter. Okay, so section 3, and again, I'm going to tell you what we're going to learn, and then we're going to learn it, and then I'm going to tell you what you learned. Okay, and again, this is consistent with the note-taking document. So in this section, we're going to learn that racial discrimination and segregation, we already learned a little bit about that, were reproduced in race-neutral terms, in terms that did not include race. Some people call it colorblind racism or racism without racist, with wealth and geography acting as proxies for race. Trust me, we'll learn what that is. So very quickly, you'll just get a quick sample of 5 examples. Slavery was reproduced with contract leasing and debt peonage. Segregated neighborhoods were reproduced with exclusionary zoning. Segregated schools were reproduced a whole bunch of ways. Voting restrictions were reproduced a whole bunch of ways. And racial disparities in the criminal justice system were reproduced a bunch of ways. The civil rights laws were very narrowly defined. Okay, so in addition to not saying anything about past discrimination, they only outlawed, like, you cannot create a policy or practice that says in the policy or practice, Blacks not allowed, Latinos excluded. Like, it has to have that. It has to specifically say that it is discriminating against a race. That's what we mean by race conscious. That means it actually, it explicitly says we are trying to discriminate against a certain race. Okay, that's all it says. So that made it very easy to accomplish the same thing, but using wealth or geography instead of race. The policies were based on wealth and geography instead of race, but achieved the exact same thing. So that's what we mean by reproduced. It means it accomplishes the exact same thing, but without mentioning race. So visually, we'd see the pre-civil rights, we had explicitly racist, race-conscious policies. That means explicitly says whites only. After civil rights laws, that's no longer legal. Now we have laws that are quote unquote race neutral. They don't mention anything about race explicitly on the paper, but they're based on wealth or geography, and they just quote unquote coincidentally have disparate impacts on Blacks and Latinos. They just coincidentally have the exact same impact, but it doesn't mention it in the policy, so therefore it's perfectly legal. Okay, and why do these policies look like they're racially neutral, but why do they have this racially disparate impact? Why do they impact Blacks and Latinos differently than whites? Because they're based on either geography or wealth. And we know that geography and wealth in this country were strongly impacted by historical discrimination, which was never dismantled. Right? So that's what I mean by when I say segregation, income, wealth are proxies for the race. It means they're standing in for race in the policy, in the law. It doesn't say whites only, but it says wealthy people who, I don't know, like this, they describe something, and it's basically, they might as well be saying white. Okay, that's what we mean by proxy. So I'm going to give you 5 examples really quick. I have a lot more detail, but I was trying to summarize it in one workshop. So One example was slavery was reproduced with contract leasing and debt peonage. So some historians refer to this as by slavery by another name. This is the book and a free PBS documentary about it if you want to know more about this. So this was done by a loophole in the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. So supposedly it outlawed slavery, right? No, because you see, there's that clever exception clause in between, except as a punishment for crime where the party shall have been duly convicted. And by the way, the documentary 13th is about exactly this. So this is a little loophole. And they drove, the former slave owners drove a Mack truck through this loophole. So what they did was they managed to extend slavery for an additional 90 years, depending on the state, depending on the area, right? The slavery by another name or slavery 2.0. They used the so-called pig laws and vagrancy statutes to create mass incarceration of Black men. And from there, they leased them out, sometimes to the former slave owners, the same former slave owners. They would lease out the convict. Sometimes you would have the very same former enslaved person working for the very same former slave owner for free. So it accomplishes the exact same thing, right? And debt peonage is pretty much the same thing. Debt peonage is you owe money, so the government, the state government, again, leases you out to the planters and to the industry. And also the local governments also use these, the convicted men on chain gangs and prison labor. And also sharecropping was so unethical, it essentially is the same thing. It essentially reproduced slavery for another 90 years without the name. But if all these laws didn't have the word, it doesn't say we're enslaving you because you're Black, so they're cool, they're fine. So let's look at the Mississippi Vagrant Act. So all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes found with no lawful employment shall be deemed vagrants and fined $50, which would be the equivalent of $798 today, and in prison. In case any fined person shall fail to pay the fine, they will be hired out to any person who will pay said fine, right? And this essentially means not just that you were unemployed, but that you could not produce the right papers when a random sheriff stopped you in the street. So you had to carry around your proof of employment at all times. The Mississippi Pig Law said, it shall be grand larceny to feloniously steal any hog, pig, cow, calf, bull, sheep, lamb, or goat of the value of $1, it's equivalent of $24 today, or more, and shall be imprisoned in the penitentiary for a term not exceeding 5 years. So this is the equivalent of today's marijuana and drug laws, right? So, for example, this is selling a freed man to pay his fine. Looks a lot like the slave auction, right? Or these are criminal child convicts. Look at their faces. Look at the chains. Look how old they are. So that's, again, I'm just giving you a quick overview, right? Example 2, segregated houses were reproduced with exclusionary zoning. So again, how do we maintain this, right? We know that the roots are redlining, but how does this manage to stay? Well, sorry, I forgot to somehow I lost the animation on this. If you follow me from the top, the darker to the lighter. So in 1917, before 1917, the late 1800s to 1917, we had racial zoning, which meant that the government, the local or state government would say, this area is white only, or no Blacks and Jews allowed in this neighborhood. But in 1970, Buchanan v. Worley ruled that government segregation ordinances violate equal protection clause. So what do they get rid of it? No, they immediately replace it with legally enforced private restrictive covenants, meaning that you still have, you have a deed in your house. A restrictive covenant means that you have a deed in a clause in your house deed or your entire housing development saying same thing, white only or no Blacks. And it's not enforced by, you notice that it's not government anymore, it's private, right? And so, but it's legally enforced by the government. So after a while, Shelley v. Kramer, declares that these restrictive, and I'm sorry, the date is wrong on that, that these private restrictive covenants are not legally enforceable by the state. Same thing, for the same reason that violates the Equal Protection Clause. So what do? They continue with these covenants, but they're socially enforced instead of legally enforced. But then the Fair Housing Act prohibits private housing discrimination on the basis of race, not by income or class. So whites replace the socially enforced zoning with economic exclusionary zoning, which is, this is the pink, single family zoning. So this zoning does not mention Black or white or Latino or any race. It is race neutral, but it is based on wealth. So they'll say, for example, in this area of town, this entire neighborhood is zoned for detached single family homes only. But of course, so that's dependent on wealth. And of course, Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately not wealthy. So it has the same effect. They can use exclusionary zoning to reproduce the old racial zoning, right? Accomplish the exact same thing without mentioning the word race. And that was upheld by the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's look at some examples. 83% of residential land in San Francisco Bay Area is zoned for detached single family homes only. That's the pink areas, all the nice areas. So, and they call this exclusionary zoning or detached single family zoning. It leads to racial and economic segregation. It leads to the concentration of poverty, and it leads to insufficient affordable housing. Closer to your home, 94% of residential land in San Jose is zoned for detached single family homes only. All that pink area, you got detached single family zoning only. So I told you this would be quick, it's just an overview. Here's example 3, segregated schools were reproduced using a whole bunch of different ways. So again, how does this get maintained, right, is the question. We know the roots, the historical roots, but how does this get maintained? Why doesn't it go away? Well, one thing is because segregated neighborhoods result in segregated schools. We already saw how they maintain segregated neighborhoods. Well, once you have segregated neighborhoods, you automatically have segregated schools. Because again, you have to go to your neighborhood school in this country because 45% of the funding comes from local property taxes. So as Nicole Hannah-Jones pointed out, you didn't have to segregate schools because you sent people to their neighborhood schools. And if you lived in a segregated neighborhood, your schools were all white or all Black. You didn't have to segregate your movie theaters or your swimming pools. Housing accomplished in the North everything that Jim Crow accomplished in the South. Another way was if you weren't happy with the level of segregation there, you could go to private school. So here we see this is the changes in private school enrollment. The blue is in the South and the red is in the North. The reason why it's separated out because there's this myth that it only occurred in the South. Everybody knows about the quote unquote segregation academies in the South, but the North and the West likes to pretend that they're more open. But you can see the huge jump in private school enrollment coincidentally in 1950 to 65 when public schools were integrating. But you see that, and you see the huge jump in the South, but you can see that the jump in private school enrollment in the North and the West is not that far behind, right? That was another way of circumventing or reproducing segregation. Oh, and here's another very innovative way. This is very new and up and coming. There are not a lot of cases of this, but in some cases where there's a wealthy white neighborhood that's part of a school district, then the wealthy white area secedes from the rest of the school district, so that they don't have to share their tax dollars with poor Black and Latino students, right? Non-white students. That's a new thing, but there's many other examples too: magnet schools, selection schools, etc. Example 4. Voting restrictions were reproduced with a whole bunch of different ways. So let's look at some of the ways. We're going to see, I'm going to tell you what Shelby County beholders in the next section, but after it allowed the proliferation of these alternative ways to suppress votes. 1,688 polling places and 13 states closed between 2012 and 2018 alone. Another common way of suppressing the vote without mentioning race is through photo ID laws, because they know, of course, that non-whites are less likely to have a photo ID. Exact match votustration laws, of course, disproportionately affect Blacks and Latinos and Asians, and they know that. You can see what's, for example, in the Georgia voter suppression law, they have all of these disproportionately affect Blacks and Latinos. North Carolina got caught. So the federal court in Richmond struck down North Carolina's voter ID law in 2016. They found the provisions, which never mention race, target African Americans with almost surgical precision. With race data in hand, the legislator amended the bill to exclude many of the alternative photo IDs used by African Americans. The bill retained only the kinds of IDs that white North Carolinians were more likely to possess. After receipt of this racial data, the General Assembly amended the bill to eliminate the first week of early voting. Thus, in what comes as close to a smoking gun as we are likely to see in modern times, the state's very justification for a challenged statute hinges explicitly on race. Specifically, it's concerned that African Americans who had overwhelmingly voted for Democrats had too much access to the franchise. As Reverend William Barber II said, Jim Crow did not retire. He went to law school and launched a second career. Meet James Crow, Esquire. Example 5, racial disparities in criminal justice system been reproduced. So for example, again, there's policies and practices that disproportionately affects Blacks and Latinos that never mention race. So for example, Black and white Americans, as a result, Black and white Americans sell and use drugs at similar rates, but Black Americans are 2.7 times as likely to be arrested for a drug-related offense. So here we can see that, in fact, whites use drugs at higher rates than Blacks and sell drugs at the same rate. And yet, Blacks are 2.5 times likely to be arrested and also much more, significantly more likely to be incarcerated. So there's not too many police roaming, let's say college dorms or the suburbs, right? Blacks are, police are in low-income Black and Latino neighborhoods. So of course they see it much more there. Or here's another more explicit one. There's racial disparities in sentencing. For example, significantly higher sentencing for crack cocaine, which is used disproportionately by Blacks, than for powder cocaine, which is used disproportionately by whites. So here we can see that 82% of crack cocaine offenders are Black, while 72% of powder cocaine offenders are white. But it's because of cost. But they have the same effect. It's the same chemical, the same effect, pretty much the same toxicity potency. Yet for 5 grams of crack cocaine, they've changed the law. They did change it after 2011, but you can get 5 years. There's a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for 28 grams of crack cocaine versus 500 grams of powder cocaine. And that was, it was even worse before 2011. Huge disparities, racial disparities. But again, not mentioning, that on the face of the policy, it's race neutral. And in fact, even the entire war on drugs is essentially also a way of attacking Blacks and Latinos without mentioning race and the whole mass incarceration. And this was admitted by Nixon's domestic policy advisor when they rolled out the war on drugs. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So just openly admitted this. Okay, so in this section, we learned that racial discrimination and segregation were reproduced in race neutral forms. Some people refer to it as colorblind racism or racism without racists, with wealth and geography acting as proxies for race, meaning that there's the stand-in for race. We saw how slavery was reproduced, segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools, voting, and racial and the disparities in criminal justice system were all reproduced using quote unquote race neutral terms. Okay, we're gonna skip that since we already did it. And then the next section is on the reproduction of racism on the policy level. Like, how is this possible? Okay, we're gonna look at the Supreme Court level. Like, why is this possible? Why is this legal? So we're gonna learn that conservatives perverted the concept of colorblindness, which led to civil rights laws being interpreted as only prohibiting intentional racial discrimination. Okay, so first we learned that the civil rights laws didn't repair the accumulated gains of historical discrimination. Second, we learned that it was just the face of it, and now we're learning that this is how we're doing this, because they wrote it that unless it's written in the law, unless it's that we're treating people differently by race, then that's fine. Instead of the original meaning of the color of the civil rights laws, which meant that segregation itself is illegal. And I did a bad job of explaining that. I will explain it better in a second. And this led to the rollback of affirmative action and the rollback of civil rights protections. Here, it's easier for me to explain it here. So the original civil rights movement definition of colorblind, right? You've heard of Dr. Martin Luther King, I have this dream, that my the Black kids and white kids, all that. When the civil rights movement was talking about colorblindness, what they meant, and very, very clearly meant, there's no ifs, ands, and questions about it. It takes 5 seconds of looking before it's very clear that they meant colorblindness as the fancy word is distributive justice mandate. It means that policies should reduce racial disparities in outcomes, wealth gap, employment gap, housing, home ownership gap, segregation, right? That's what we're trying to change. But conservatives along the way redefined the concept of colorblind and the legal doctrine of colorblindness to mean colorblindness as a procedural justice dictate, means on process only, that in the process, like on paper, policies should treat all races the same. Like the policy can't say we're treating Blacks and whites differently. And it does not matter if the result is huge disparities and racial disparities. In segregation, it does not matter the result, as long as that piece of paper, that policy, that law, that announcement doesn't explicitly discriminate, doesn't explicitly treat Blacks and Latinos differently, then we're cool, we're fine. In fact, that's good, we're colorblind, okay? And this was a very willful distortion and changing. So we can see it here in their own words. So here is Judge John Wisdom in 1967, in the beginning, right? Talking about colorblindness. The Constitution is both colorblind and color conscious. To avoid conflict with the Equal Protection Clause, a classification that denies a benefit, causes harm, or imposes a burden must not be based on race. Pretty clear. In that sense, the Constitution is colorblind. But the Constitution is also color conscious to prevent discrimination being perpetuated and to undo the effects of past discrimination. Pretty clear, right? By 2007, Chief Justice John Roberts, right, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, meaning you can't mention race, which means that you can't correct racial disparities. You see that about face? It's a huge, incredible, it's an incredible about face, an incredible recodifying and redefining of colorblindness. It's very similar to how conservatives are redefining CRT, critical race theory, to meet their sense. And in fact, the way they changed it means that the civil rights laws are actually being used more to protect whites against so-called reverse racism than they are to help Blacks. In Backey, Justice Lewis Powell insisted that constitutional harm occurred the moment that government took express notice of race, meaning we don't even want to talk about racism. If the state expressly mentioned race, comment almost exclusively in affirmative action programs, then the court would review the legislation with extreme skepticism in virtually every case, overturning the challenged affirmative action program. If, however, the government avoided any direct invocation of race, the new normal in racial discrimination cases, because as we see, they don't mention race anymore in racial discrimination. They don't have to. They just do it by wealth of geography. All of a sudden, then the court would demand proof of malice. You have to prove that the institution is intentionally racially discrimination with malice, an insuperable hurdle. A reactionary form of colored blindness became king, quick to condemn all corrective uses of race, but blind to racial discrimination against minorities. So that's how this is all possible because of this distortion. And so, for example, affirmative action has been rolled back. Even with affirmative action, Blacks and Hispanics are more underrepresented in top colleges than 35 years ago. This is because affirmative action no longer exists. Preferential admissions to whites, which don't mention race, are legal. Okay, so here, this, for example, this is all students admitted to Harvard in 2014-19. This was data that I took from that federal case, Students for Fair Admissions, about Asian students being discriminated against. This in the first column is all whites admitted under preferential admissions. 43% of white admits were this was private Harvard admissions data. 43% of white admits were admitted under preferential admissions. These preferential admissions include athletes, and no, I'm not talking about basketball players and baseball players. I'm talking about lacrosse players and fencing. So of athletes who applied, 86% were admitted. Of legacy students who applied, meaning their parents had gone to the school, 34%. Of dean's interest list applicants, those are basically people who donated money, 42% admitted. Of children of faculty, 47% admitted. Compared to African Americans, 7.5% were admitted. In the second column, here is a subset of the first column. It's unqualified whites who were admitted under preferential admission. Sorry. So of these, so this is a subset, meaning of that first column, how many of them were unqualified according to the Harvard admissions officers' own internal standards. Like they went through and did calculations, and then usually these would be the ones that would be cut. That would make the first cut. They would not make they did not meet minimum standards, and yet they were admitted anyhow because of these preferential admissions, 16% of total admits. And then because affirmative action doesn't exist anymore, the researchers were forced to list every single Black person who was admitted. And so you can see that and all these preferential admissions that go primarily to wealthy white students are perfectly legal because they don't mention race, whereas affirmative action of Blacks and Latinos is illegal. Here's another example. In Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was gutted. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required the areas in green. These are what they called covered jurisdictions. These are areas that had long histories of racial discrimination. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act required these areas to obtain federal pre-clearance for proposed changes in voting procedures. The Shelby County v. Holder, I told you I would tell you about that, in 2013 ruled gutted Section 5 of the VRA. They said that it was unconstitutional in light of current conditions. Guess what in light current conditions are? The fact that there's no more racism, according to them. So that is why we see the sudden rise in voter suppressions in Georgia and Texas and everywhere. Also, they rolled back the desegregation federal court orders. So Oklahoma CPS v. Dowell, schools are not required to take action against school segregation due to if it's due to residential segregation. They're like, oh well, too bad. So they got rid of all of the federal desegregation orders, and surprise, surprise, school segregation jumped up again for both Blacks and whites, Blacks and Latinos. So what we learned is that this was made possible by these changes in the law. Okay, and on the individual level, we don't have these last two parts are very short. On the individual level, we're going to learn that economic and social status incentives lead people who benefit from systems of inequity to support policies that reinforce these systems and to engage in individual behavior that reinforces these systems. It's called opportunity hoarding. And this is often true even when they support racial and economic equity in principle. So,
hey, Ayo,
so
could we take like a 3-minute bio break?
sure. And let's, yep.
Or is that okay? Or do you want?
Yeah, no, it's great.
Okay.
My son took my phone, so I have no idea of the timing or my.
Okay, yeah,
so,
sorry. Okay, yeah.
So go ahead. You have to do the time.
Yeah. So if we could take a 3-minute bio break, that would be great. Let's come back at 2:32.
Perfect. Thanks. Can we turn on is Daddy here?
Thank you, everyone, and we'll just wait for Ayo to come back, and we will start.
I'm here. We just got 5 minutes.
Okay, here we go.
So opportunity hoarding, which was coined by economist Richard Reeves in the book Dream Hoarders, argues that 20% the top 20% of Americans have created a stark divide with behaviors and policies that limit economic mobility for lower income groups. And he doesn't specify race, but If you're in the upper middle class, you get to buy a more expensive house than most people can afford. You then get a home mortgage interest tax deduction. You can then use local zoning ordinances, we learned about that, to ensure that only people like you can live in your neighborhood. And then you can organize your school admissions policies based on neighborhoods, right? We learned about that too, which means that even your public schools can be predominantly affluent and high quality. Reeve says that being a successful parent shouldn't mean rigging the playing field. The question is, where's the line when good parenting becomes some form of hoarding or kind of cheating? How do we manage schools? How do we vote in a local zoning bill? Do we play the legacy card or the donation card? And here are some policies and practices that he names as opportunity hoarding. Legacy admissions. When you get into a school, you get priority or preference at a school because of your parents went there. Preferential tax treatment of investment income. Home mortgage interest tax deductions. 529 college saving plans. And I have one of those for my son in full honesty. Exclusionary zoning. Occupational licensing, which means that limits the number of doctors or the numbers of dentists or veterinarians. Restrictions on the immigration of white collar professionals, especially for STEM professions. Granting internships through personal networks and even private schools. And I went to one of those. So in other words, regardless of the links on your social media or the signs in your lawn, if in your daily life you live in a segregated neighborhood, have a segregated friend group, and send your kids to segregated schools, you really should consider if you're living up to MLK's vision. So that very quickly was how individuals add to that, okay? How individuals help reproduce and reinforce these systems, okay? And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the myths that allow us to play these games that rationalize what's going on both the policy level and also that individuals use, especially privileged individuals use to help themselves feel better about this and to not question this, to reproduce this. So we saw the myth of racial economic progress. That's a huge myth, right? That the Civil Rights Act supposedly ended racism, that we live in a post-racial society, that we live in a colorblind society, that Blacks have gone so much ahead. Look at this. There's people who think who voted 200%, who thought that Blacks actually made twice as much as whites, right? The huge myth going on. Here's some of the other myths that prop up this entire system and rationalize it. Here's the question was, how many of a group of 100 people would move from the bottom 20% of income to the top 20% over a 10-year period? Economists call this social mobility, right? The American dream, the rags to riches story, right? The survey respondents estimated 16%. The reality is 1%. American dream may exist, but not in the United States, in Europe or Australia somewhere. Here's another one. How many of a group of 100 people would move from the bottom 20% of income over a 10-year period with some kind of college degree? Another huge myth, right? The survey respondents said 61%. Reality is 31%. We have a lot less upward mobility, rags to riches, American dream than in our heads in mythology. And then we have this dream that we have this image that we have the most mobility of any other country. The reality is we have the least mobility of all the other developed countries. Well, UK is usually neck and neck with us, depending on the survey. But we have the green is this is the percent of sons with low earning fathers who are in the richest 25% of the population. So that rags to riches, that's like about the 9%, versus the yellow is top earning fathers who are in the richest 25%. So if your daddy's wealthy, you'll probably be wealthy. If your daddy's poor, it's very hard for you to overcome that. And this is the whole idea of education being the engine of mobility is definitely not true. So this is data on the percent of kids who graduate from college. And the data on the left is low test scores, middle test scores, and high test scores of families in the poorest quartile, for the poorest 25%. And over here is the richest, the low kids who with low test scores, middle test scores, and high test scores of wealthiest families. And these are test scores, are 8th grade scores on standardized assessments of math. And we see here that wealthy students with low test scores are actually slightly more likely to graduate from college than poor students with high test scores. So basically, your family wealth is much more important than your academic ability for graduating from college. This is parsed apart Black income mobility versus white income mobilities. So white income mobility is already very low compared to other countries. This is the percent of poor kids who become rich adults. More specifically, it's the rate of kids with parents who are in the poorest 20% who make it to the wealthiest 20% as adults. Wealthiest 20% is not that high. We're talking teachers and firemen, okay? We're not talking Oprah here, okay? 11% of poor whites make it to the level where they're making as much as a fireman and teacher versus 3% of Blacks. And that was this. And so to conclude, I'm just gonna summarize real quick. So we have now answered our 2 interrelated questions. Why has there been so little progress in racial economic equity in the 57 years since the Civil Rights Act? And why do most Americans so vastly overestimate racial economic progress? And we saw that they were interrelated because these myths are what rationalize and allow the forces that stymie progress. So we learned that the Civil Rights Act only outlawed future discrimination. They didn't repair the cumulative gains of past discrimination. That we see the historical discrimination through the wealth gap and segregation. We learned that the racial discrimination and segregation were reproduced in quote unquote race neutral forms with wealth and geography acting as proxies with race. We saw several examples. And we saw how the courts and conservatives distorted the meaning of colorblindness to make it more of a defense against quote unquote reverse racism against whites than it is to help Blacks and Latinos. And we learned that individuals act in wealthy individuals, privileged individuals engage in opportunity hoarding, which also reinforces that reproduction and makes them resistant to policies and change. And we finally saw some of those myths and mythologies that's sort of like the glue, the rationalization for all of this, the myths about affirmative action, the myths about the American dream, the myths about the Civil Rights Act ending racism. Okay, so we have completed, so I'd like to do that process again. Onar, could you time us again? Let's make it for 4 minutes. So again, I very strongly encourage you to reflect in written form, either at home on your notes or in the chat. The nice thing about the chat is that we can get a view of what the room is looking at, thinking, sorry.
Okay, 4 minutes on. Thanks, Ayo. All right, folks, 2 minutes. Great. If you all can start finishing up your final thoughts and or comments. Would like to turn on your video or put it in chat. Yep. All yours, Io. Back to you.
No, I'm just opening it up. We can just open up for discussion now. I'd like to remind you to share the airspace, and I'd love to, I hope everybody has had the opportunity to read through all those comments. It's very helpful to see where everyone's head is, and lots of different great examples, great connections with personal experiences. But yeah, let's open up the floor. Got a quiet room, or are people still processing?
Hi, this is Sabrina. I have a question, and I'm hoping there's really good questions that are in the commentary, and I'm wondering if we could take that time while we have some space to maybe answer a couple of those. I know there's a couple that were recently put out with this last question Q&A that you had asked us to reflect on that I'd like to hear about, if possible.
Okay, could somebody help me out and read through and identify the questions? I saw one of the questions, more recent, about I was looking for a slide. I wanted to. I like to. I can't speak without visuals. Where is it? I can't find any more, but something about what if people knew. So on one hand, yes, awareness does help, but on the other hand, there is a huge, what they call principal policy gap, which means that, and I was looking for my slide on it, which means that there is a huge gap among whites, between their stated principles versus actually voting on policies to address it, or actually engaging in practices. unfortunately. They call it the principal policy gap or the principal practice gap. So that is a problem. So it helps a little bit, but not completely. In the end, people will vote for their self-interest, honestly, unfortunately. So, but let me look for that slide and to show you visually. Well, I guess I'll just tell you. It was a study done a couple years ago in Wake County, North Carolina, which is a relatively educated liberal area, right? That's where Raleigh, the RDU, the research triangle is. So when they asked participants about the importance of integrated schools in general, then it was very reliable. Conservatives voted against and liberals were very much in favor. But when they asked about integrating the classroom, then suddenly most of the liberal white parents voted pretty much the same as the conservatives. So basically, in theory, in principle, it's great, but if it affects my child, no. So it's very unfortunate, but and that was the one question I saw. Can somebody else identify another question?
Yeah, Io, there was another one. I think this was specifically in the section around the federal home programs. So the question is, how can we close the gap? Federal home loan programs for low-income households in specific geographic regions. We've seen increased coverage of actual racial inequities in the last year or so, and they're curious to know if the perception might have shifted somewhat.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to answer. So I didn't answer specifically that first part, but the question about perceptions shifting is, yes, that's great that perceptions have shifted, but study after study and after example after example after example demonstrate that perceptions alone shifting alone are not enough, that they rarely lead to people actually supporting programs. So that's what I was,
Okay.
with respect to the federal home loan program, I think so, but yes, specific, I did not read that, specific geographic region. Yes, I believe so. And in fact, I think maybe you're referring to this book that just came out. What was her name? Let's see. This book is, I have to, can you see it? It's right off the presses. It just got published like 2 weeks ago.
Wow.
She talks about this. What's her name? Cheryl Cashin. So she, I don't think it's very well named, but she talks about, and she has, let's see, she has another book, her previous book. It's going to take too long. Her previous book is something like basically pushing affirmative action, not based. Obviously, you can't base it on race anymore. You saw how legally that was completely upset. But she says instead, have affirmative action based on place, and that way you also and that way low income whites, low income Latinos, low income Hmong, any community, but poverty tends to be segregated. And that's when we see the structural effects. We talk about structural racism, structural inequity. That's what we mean. That it's not specific to the individual. It's usually specific to the place. You saw how geography really impacts access to opportunity. That's basically when we talk about structural racism, institutional racism, that's basically what we're talking about. So yes, I wasn't going to talk about that, of course, until 7. That's the 7th of the last workshop. And I would prefer not to talk a lot about policies and solutions until number 7, because you'll have more elements. And also I'll be prepared. I'll have all my slides and stuff. But I will give you that advanced look that I believe place-based solutions are one of the key answers. But for additional questions, I really would prefer not to talk about solutions yet. We will have an entire workshop based on that.
Yeah, and so people are sharing some experiences that they've had.
I'm going to go ahead and ask something. Somebody wrote, "This information is so heavy, it is difficult to process so quickly." I'd like to know if you have any, I'll be, of course, be talking to the team afterwards, but if any individuals have any suggestions on what I can do to help everybody process the information better, I would love to hear those. If you could either tell me now, or you could pass them on to Cynthia or Onar. And I'm wondering if the breaks were helpful, if those processing prompts were helpful, if the outline was helpful, if those summary of each sections was helpful, and what else additional would have been helpful. Okay, so the outline helped. That's good. Any other suggestions, an additional break or?
Other comments? I mean, for me, IO, as we move forward, like this was a good what would you call that? Run, right? Like the information flow, the reflective questions were very helpful.
Okay, good. They said
Yeah,
2 break.
yeah.
Um,
Okay.
You know what, we could, since people are pretty quiet, how do you feel about breaking up? I should have checked that first with Cynthia and Onar, but Cynthia and Onar, how do you feel about breaking up into rooms now, or?
Sure. I mean, we can do it, right? So yeah. Let me just, okay. Okay, so we'll have, how many do we have? 24, maybe 3 groups, right? Around that. And then we can take a poll. Okay, thanks, Karen. All right, so randomly, we'll just break out into 3 groups, and then we could have that conversation. And we are here until 3:30, so we'll come back maybe like around 3:20 or so for our big group, for our closing, and also more announcements. Here we go. Three, Valerie, I'll move you to room 2. Okay. Stay in. I think I got everyone.
Good job. I'm digging the flow, digging the flow.
I did too.
I have to leave to my next meeting, but
Yep.
good job. All right,
Thank you,
I'll catch y'all
Cynthia.
soon.
Okay,
Bye.
bye. Hey, Maria. Hey, Maria.
Hey, Leonard. I don't know why. Okay, so sorry, I don't know if you guys, it wouldn't let me in on my computer, my laptop or my desktop. I was only able
Really?
to join. Yeah, and I use the same link, so I don't know what happened. It only let me join in my phone.
That is, you know what? Hala also was having some issues with her computer.
Yeah, I don't know what happened because I would try the link and then I was like, oh, you need to register. It was the co-host link. And then I tried registering. And it's like, oh, you can't register because you're a host. And then I was like, okay. So then I tried my other computer and then it didn't work. And then I tried my phone and on my phone, it didn't give me a problem. And I was like, what is wrong with you?
Right.
So I put it in the team. So I was like, oh no, I can only meet like, the last part.
Right,
And I was like, uh-oh, I'm so sorry.